A restless wind urged them up the slopes of Nagga's hill, as the grey light of dawn made the great bones of the Grey King's Hall stark against the sky. The sounds of thralls and salt wives faded behind them as they climbed, for such had no voices to speak besides the bones of Nagga. Both Harmon's boots and the butt of his long spear were soaked with dew by the time he made the peak, and saw the drowned men surrounding their hooded priest, clasping their driftwood armory. Despite the chill of the morning, the servants of the drowned god wore little more than thin, ragged robes, draped in seaweed and shells that hung from their shoulders to their bare, blackened feet. Harmon's kin trailed behind him. He had left his wife and young children on Cape Kraken, but 2 uncles and a cousin had deigned to sail with him to Old Wick. Garrick Hayes had spent half his life raiding up and down the stony shore, until a wound in his leg had never quite healed. Vicon Hayes, Harmon's father's brother, preferred Iron Man's Bay, striking against the villages and keeps far enough from the new stronghold there to take plunder and thralls aplenty. Vicon's son, Uras Hayes, was only 5 and 10, but he'd been taken on his first trading voyage at 9 and his first raid at 13. Though he had only a thin line of brown fuzz on his upper lip, he fancied himself enough of a man to stand at a king's moot. Gorold Great Iron was not difficult for Harmon to spot. He towered over other men as a father might over his stripling sons, his great pale beard scarce reaching their heads as it settled on his broad chest. As the Lord of the Giant's Fist, Harmon owed Gorold Giantbeard fealty, but here it was otherwise. At King's Moot, every captain was a king on his own deck, and so long as they gathered for the choosing, no Iron Man owed allegiance to any other. And yet, for whatever reason, Giantbeard had asked the men of the Fists, the lords and their retinues and kin, to stand together, forming one part of the iron crown that ringed the top of this holy hill. And Hayes had decided not to provoke him by doing otherwise.
Mayhaps Gorold intends to make a claim,
Harmon thought.
Our shouts may seem all the louder if we stand as one.
Harmon would not begrudge him if that was the case. It seemed right to him that the Fist should finally be recognized as a true part of the High Kingdom, rather than an irrelevant appendage. Great Iron was not one of the names that was well known at King's Moot, nor was it remembered in the ancient songs of the Iron Men. They were of small regard, seen as no more than an obscure family who ruled over the coasts of a wild frontier, far from the shores of Old Wick. The Great Irons claimed descent from the Grey King through House Grey Iron, of whom they claimed they were an offshoot, born of sons born to salt wives in days long forgotten. How well that was believed was hard to say. Men of the Isle oft dismissed those of the Fist, Hayes knew. He had felt the bitter taste of their regard the previous night, when feasts and finger dancing had felt of greater concern than the matter of who would pass out drunk to arise a king the next day. To ask a stone tree, a spar, or a salt cliff, one would never have thought that the Giant's Fist was the size of all the Iron Islands put together, and then some.
But this King's Moot was a queer one, and that might make all the difference,
Hayes thought. To begin with, the last several kings chosen at the moot had been all but bitter disappointments to the Ironborn. Eric V, Harlaw, had managed to lose Fair Isle. Bad Brother had shamed all the Isles by his slaying of the sons of the king who preceded him, and Torgon the Latecomer, despite coming to the Driftwood Crown with the support of every man who commanded a deck, had managed to lose the Misty Isles. Since then, House Grey Iron had not even bothered with King's Moot, perhaps thinking that a more direct line of succession might improve the failing lot of the Ironborn. If so, it had not borne fruit. The Cape of Eagles was lost now as well, leaving the Ironborn with only the Fist to show for their once great conquests, which had once stretched from the Bay of Ice to the Arbor. Change was needed. That was plain from the talk around the campfires, where captains shared pilfered pork and stolen strong wine. The Ironborn could no longer rely on the strength of their iron and the arms that clutched it. The Greenland kingdoms were changing, and there were new men there with weapons to rival their own. No longer would iron spears drive relentlessly through their mail, or a mace carve in their helmets with a single strike. And so it was that Harmond Hayes, Lord of Cape Kraken, took his place besides the other lords of the Fist, and awaited the beginning of the moot. Great Iron and his sons were not the only ones from the salty shores who had climbed the slippery slopes of Old Wick. Gearman Steep was here, his perpetually sour expression touched with anticipation. A smattering of long pebbles and cold strands were spread about the gathering, too. Even Corrid Pebblebelly, who had imbibed so many horns of ale the night before that he had passed out before he could eat the mutton leg clasped in his other hand. Steep muttered a greeting as Harmond and his kin took their place among them, and the Hayes offered Gorold a respectful nod. Then they turned towards the rest of the gathering. There were 14 kings on the Iron Isles. Each island had 2, one to govern the land and the other the fleet. Rock kings made laws, settled disputes, did justice. Salt kings led the war fleets. Occasional disputes existed between the two, as they did between all men of power, but for the most part, the system had given strength to the structure of the Ironborn realm, even through the reign of turbulent kings. Yet only the Iron Islands had kings of salt and rock, and only the largest 7 of them. The outer territories had merely lords, none of whom were granted the same prestige and respect as the 14 kings. Harmond could recognize a few of the kings by sight, the older ones who were best known. He looked for Torek Goodbrother, before recalling that the old terror had been left crippled by a wound last winter, and had handed the kingship over to his eldest son. He saw an unremarkable man of middle years, with a great black horn tied to his belt, and took him for the new Rock King of Great Wick. The Salt King of the largest of the Iron Islands was easier to spot. Harris Hoare had a closely cropped head, but it was contrasted by a magnificent black beard. Not so long as giant beards, but far more ornately curled and groomed. He liked men to refer to him as Harris Finehair, and so they did, in his hearing. Everywhere else, men called him Harry Hoare. No one could doubt the tenacity of the Hoares, but none fully trusted them either. Black of blood, black of hair, black of heart, so the saying went. It would not surprise Hayes in the least if Harry intended to claim the crown. Ambition had moved the Hoares from Orkmont to Great Wick, and no doubt it would move them to a crown if the opportunity arose. He seemed to have many around him. Harmond saw shields engraved with the pines of Orkwood, a man he thought he knew as humble, descended from thralls and saltwives, and in that vein too, a wretched, pale, and flat-faced man who could only have been a cod.
Well, that was queer,
Harmond thought. Orkwood and Cod were both houses from Orkmont, and though the Hoares had hailed from there in far-flung days, surely it would be expected for those houses to support House Grey Iron in holding forth to the kingship. Harmond frowned, and his eyes searched the crowd anew. Where was Euron Grey Iron? Euron had been the desired successor of the old king, his great-uncle Eragon IV. But unlike with his own succession from Torgon Latecomer, the drowned priests had insisted on the restoration of the moot. Had Euron decided the best course was simply to ignore the moot? If so, it appeared to have been a mistake. If the likes of Cod, Orkwood, and Netley were rallying around Harry Hoare instead. All the same, it boded well for Harmond himself. Any Grey Iron who made a claim on Nagga's Hill was bound to sway a number of the captains, no matter what he said. In Euron's absence, they may pay more heed to a Great Iron in his place. Gorold Giantbeard would not make a bad king, Harmond reckoned, no worse than the last few who had worn the driftwood crown by any means. Geralt was a hard man, a harsh man, but the Ironborn admired that, even if they cursed him from the oars. He was not a man to sit idle either, as Eragon and Torgon Grey-Iron had seemed wont to do from the moment they climbed upon their thrones, even if Torgon had found the Misty Isles more of a home to him than Great Wick in his youth. It was then that the drowned men began to beat the ground with their staves and cudgels, and the priest at their center let his hooded cloak fall. Many gasps and mutters ran through the crowd as they beheld the priest, for in his right hand he clutched a pale white staff, finely carved and inlaid with ancient runes. Even Harmond could not mistake it, even as he was from cliffs and forests far away. Galon Whitestaff had once been the drowned priest who dared to challenge King Eric the Ugly, another Grey-Iron, who thought to seize the kingship without the moot. Eric broke his crown in his hands and cast it into the sea, and another man took the kingship.
A drum?
Harmond thought.
Or was it a harlaw?
This priest was not Galon, but he had the staff sure enough, carved from the very bones of Nagga's hill, as one telling had it, or otherwise from one of the Greenland's demon trees.
We were born from the sea,
the priest began, quoting the ancient words that began almost every holy rite.
and to the sea we must return.
He spoke softly, so that men would strain to listen, though his voice gained strength as he spoke, as a wave builds before crashing upon the shore.
Aragon is dead.
He continued.
He wore the driftwood crown and claimed to be king of all Iron Men. The king is dead!
The drowned men shouted out as one.
But what is dead can never die,
The priest recited.
but rises again, harder and stronger. A king must rise again, but he must be chosen. Chosen by the captains and the kings, and chosen by the drowned god, who speaks through his people. Listen! Listen to the sea and to the waves, for they shall carry us a king.
The drowned men beat the ground once more.
A king shall rise, a king shall rise.
As the cries faded away, the priest raised his staff, closing his eyes as a quiet engulfed the gathering, save for the calling of gulls, the blustering winds, distant rumbling of the sea below. It seemed a long time had passed before the priest spoke again, and in that time a strange trance seemed to have fallen over the captains and kings, a spell none of them had the courage to break. Perhaps Whitestaff's staff had not lost its ancient magic, or perhaps it was merely respect for the drowned god.
Is there a king who stands amongst us?
The priest demanded of the gathered throng.
Are there any here who dare to seek the judgment of our God and his chosen people? There is.
A wealth of plunder spilt from great square chests that groaned as they were toppled forwards. Rings of gold and silver, bars and ingots, 100 handweights at least per chest. It was more wealth than House Hayes had won since the time of its founding, when King Corrid Blacktide had rewarded his leal captains with lordships on their expanding conquests. They had been drunk on the glory of victory then, had raised halls and felled trees, but failed to share in the far richer rewards when Corrid sacked Old Town and laid claim to the arbor.
Even from the start they spat on us.
Harmond reflected.
And here is the richest house on all the islands flaunting their spoils.
Boric Harlaw stepped forwards as many captains and even lords dove at his feet, grasping for bars and rings in such a way that it looked like they were all bowed in submission. He was a man of middling years, no beard, but a thick mustache that made him resemble one of the walruses that occasionally boarded on the beaches of Cape Kraken on the journey back to the Bay of Ice. His hair was rusted iron, kept on the crown of his head with a gutting knife, while the sides were fully shorn. Around his shoulders, he wore a lion-skin pelt he had made into a cloak, so that great paws were gripping the chest of his jerkin. Harlaw meant to make a show of it, that much was plain. Pebblebelly had begun to stumble forwards himself, until Giant Beard had given him a look that reminded him he was sober.
The Ironborn are not what they were.
Harlaw began, as his newly bought captains began to get to their feet and scuttle away.
Our writ once ran wherever the sound of waves could be heard, or men caught the scent of salt on the air. Now we have little, and less. 7 islands, many rocks and more to be sure, and a fist. Why, I ask you, are you lesser men than your sires?
A thundering series of protests and curses emerged from the great ring, and for a moment it seemed Harlaw might have misjudged. Boric seemed entirely unbothered by their rage, however, and began to circle between the drowned men and the Iron Crown.
Are your cocks limp and lifeless? Do your hands fumble and drop your axes? Do you not have the breath in your lungs to blow a horn without fainting?
With each accusation, the crowd became even more restless and angered, until one man, losing control, darted out from the crowd, sword in hand, and charged King Boric. Boric looked at him as though he were a dog that presumed to hump at his leg. With one hand, he grabbed the attacker's sword arm, and with one leg, he likely doomed the man's future children. The would-be killer fell to the ground. Boric threw his head back and laughed, and after a few moments, the guffaw began to spread through the crowd, as though the gathered captains and kings were drunks at a feast.
No,
Boric shouted.
You are not. You are Ironborn. You are conquerors and kings, reavers and rapers, reapers and takers. I know why we lost the fruits of our great tree, the stones beneath our feet, and the thralls to man our halls.
What is that then?
Harry Hoare heckled from between cupped hands.
Because the Ironfoot, the Ravenfeeder, the Coldwind, and the Maiden's Bane gave way to the Flat, the Old, the Bald, the Bad, and the Late.
That won another series of laughs from the Iron Men, and now it could not be doubted that all the captains were listening to the walrus. Even Giant Beard had coughed in a way that hinted at laughter, even if he fought it down with another scowl.
It is your kings who have failed you, Iron Men. Our last 2 kings were content to sit when the wind died and grow old on a flat sea. Not I, no.
What would you do?
One of Good Brother's younger sons called out.
Conjure up more wind with all of your blabbing?
No.
Boric countered without missing a beat.
I'd pull out the oars, you gormless cunt.
Another round of laughter, and King Boric pulled himself up to his full and self-satisfied height.
The last Harlaw kings weren't any of that,
he pointed out conversationally.
Eric V took back Fair Isle after another king let it slip.
Old Crom Stone Tree came forward holding an old shield, with 3 long ships carved into its surface. He placed it on the ground, and without a moment's pause, Boric stamped on it, shattering it into kindling.
Then Haron Harlaw cut down the Gardener King,
Boric continued, as though such a man were of little note,
when he presumed to try and stop him from sacking Old Town.
The king reached into his breeches and withdrew a golden amulet wrought in the shape of a smiling bearded face.
Haron took this after he took his head. Gold lasts longer.
With that, he dropped the pendant onto the pile of plunder.
It can all be ours again.
Boric promised.
Bear Island to the Arbor, all of it. But we can have no more kings win a throne through doing nothing and ruling less once they don a crown.
It was a good performance, Harmond had to admit. Were he one of the old families of the Isles, he might have been taken in by it. There was truth in Harlaw's words, he could not deny, but there were lies too, as should be expected. Eric V, Harlaw, had been a worthy king in his youth, but his kingdom had aged and withered with him, and he had lost his prized conquest by the time he died. Heron Harlaw had slain a king, aye, but he had not won his kingdom, or expanded the writ of the Iron Men any further beyond the misty isles at the mouth of the Mander. All the same, a great number were now calling.
Boric King! Harlaw! Reaper!
It might have ended there and then, for Harmond was surprised to see Gorald Great Iron make no move to attempt to break up the din. If he intended to make a claim, now was the time, or else it seemed Borek Harlaw might well be carried to a crown on the winds he had stirred. Instead, the silent giant merely stood there, leaning on his long axe, watching the revelry as though he were only watching something mildly unpleasant. In the end, it was a black horn that broke the spell, or rather, 6 black horns, each blown by a son of Torek Goodbrother. They declined in age from around 40 to barely older than Harmon's nephew, the youngest two being twins of one another. It was the eldest one who stepped forward, however.
I am Andric, Goodbrother.
The rather ordinary-looking man shouted, but the fact that few already knew his name was already a poor start.
Not King of Great Wake.
Aye,
Mordred Drum cackled.
because your father's a cripple and he outlived all his brothers.
That evoked a fresh fit of laughs from the crowd. It seemed Borek Harlaw's scorn for past kings had truly taken root amongst the captains and kings. Andric was a man of twice Drum's years, but his mouth dropped open, and all the words he had been planning merely turned into a rasping breath.
House Goodbrother has returned more kings at a king's moot than any house but Grey Iron.
One of Andric's brothers shouted.
Aye,
Harry called out as he tugged on his fanciful beard plate.
you gave us bad brother, and shamed us all so much we haven't had a king's moot since.
There were several murmurs of agreement. Bad Brother had left a worse taste than most tyrants in the mouths of the Iron Men. Even on the Giant's Fist, men spat when they heard that name. Andric Goodbrother's dismay had turned to anger.
I am not Yulathon, bad brother.
No,
Drum remarked.
now it takes 6 of you to make a king's worth. Now belt up, Anders, and show us what gifts you brought.
Harmond felt like he was watching a tower slowly collapse. It was a hideous, sad thing, but he couldn't quite seem to look away. Many men helped themselves to the fists of iron and finely wrought weapons that Andric Goodbrother had brought them, but almost none of them deigned to shout his name. Not even all his brothers. Vicon Greyjoy went next, and men listened, for Greyjoy was another storied house of the Iron Islands, and had produced many of its most celebrated kings, and very few of its worst ones. Even Loran the Old, whom Borek Harlaw had offhandedly dismissed, was as well remembered for his conquest of Bear Island as Eric V had been for taking Fair Isle. More so, even, since Loran had the good sense to die before the Northmen retook Bear Island. But in the end it was for little. Often the wisdom went that the man who spoke last would do best at Kingsmoot, because he could read the mood of everything that had gone before, and he could have the last word. But something had seemed to go awry today. By speaking first, Harlaw seemed to have set the table for everything that followed, and since no one could match his gifts, everything else on offer just seemed paltry. Too many captains and lords were clutching their golden arm rings to settle for silver. And still, Gorald Great Iron made no move to speak. It was Harry Hoare that next stepped forward to address the moot, with the lords of Orkmont standing behind him.
You all know me.
Harris began, and without any hesitation, threw open boxes of arms and armor. Men stared, for these were not weapons of bronze, or simple forged iron. They more resembled silver, and the weapons gleamed even in the grey marrow light. Mordred Drum scratched his pate.
What's that you've brought?
Harris Hoare's beard smiled.
That's the future, Maud. Harlow isn't wrong when he says we've got to be bold, but he's just got gold and hot air.
Borek bristled from where he stood.
You want to come here and see what else I've got for you, black blood?
Harry chuckled.
If kicking a man in his balls made you king, Boric, I'd be Emperor of fucking Valyria right now, with a Rhoynish queen noshing on my knob.
That earned some titters from the crowd.
No, what makes a good king is seeing the world around you and making it your own. It's well and good for Harlaw to tell you he'll be another Eric, who won an island and lost it over again. But what future is there in that?
Some mumbles and murmurs went through the crowd at that, whilst many of Harlaw's supporters heckled and jeered.
What future are you proposing then?
Harris Hoare turned towards the men of the Fist, as though seeing them for the first time. Giant Beard was watching him now, leaning on his enormous long axe.
A future where we have victory.
Hoare answered simply.
You don't sail far enough. Most of us don't. We see rich pickings along the Sunset Sea, and we think, why bother sailing further? The coast of Dawn is long and perilous, and there's fuck all there anyway, but things are changing.
He reached down to pick up one of the pieces he had brought, a grey axe that he held up for all to see.
Ships are sailing across the narrow sea, hundreds of them, filled with men wearing armour that bronze can't pierce, and weapons that carve through mail. Why do you think the eagles on the Cape have held us at bay? Where's Baron Blacktide? Why is he still away?
Harry's grin was hungry.
The Greenland kingdoms are about to fall, but we can rise.
Then why do we need you?
Giant Beard said in his deep growl. Men turned to look, first at Gorold, and then at Hoare.
Because I know what they want, where they are, and which of these Andals, as they call themselves, will join us, and which ones won't. I know where they're the strongest, and where the Greenlanders are the weakest. In short, because I'll win you a kingdom. I'm not one of the old names, it's true, but the old names have brought you here. So you can take Harlaw's gold, and maybe he'll take Bear Island for a year, Fair Isle for a season. But is that what you want?
Slowly but surely, they came forward. Some took an axe, others a sword, others grabbed the armor. The chant was building, and so were those from Harlaw's supporters.
Oh, Blackblood! King Harry! Oh,
King Harry!
Boric King! Harlaw! Harlaw Hall!
For a while, it seemed as though the King's Moot might descend into a shouting match, until the priest with his ancient staff raised his arms, and the drowned men beat their cudgels again.
Silence.
The priest called, and gradually the cries died down.
Listen. Listen to the call of the deep. Do not shout so loudly that you drown out the god. Wait.
A deep boom came from the sea below. It was a deep and terrible rumbling that immediately silenced the priest and caught the attention of every man there. And then a man screamed. Andric Goodbrother had an axe buried in his neck, blood spurting frantically as he grabbed at the handle, as though pulling it free would somehow save his life. Then, with his own eyes, Harmond saw Cod draw a wicked blade across Harris Hoare's throat. Harry fell to his knees, gargling and grasping at the wound. He died face down in the dirt.
What madness is this?
Harmond thought. Suddenly men were fighting everywhere. Swords and axes were hacking and stabbing, and men were suddenly appearing over the rim of the hill, forming a larger ring around the gathered captains.
Men of the First!
Gorold Giantbeard roared, yanking his long axe from the ground and lifting it high.
Take up arms for the king!
King? What king? There are far too many kings on this fucking hill already, and we still do not have one in common.
Harmond pulled his spear from the ground and held it in front of him, and his uncles did the same. He watched in horror as Giantbeard descended on Boric Harlaw, his enormous axe spinning above his head. Men fled in his wake, but the walrus stood firm, drawing his sword and spitting a curse. It didn't save him. Great Iron's axe blade cleaved Harlaw nigh in half. Harmond would never recall the moments that followed. He seemed to remember fighting Vicon Greyjoy's men, stabbing one through the heart before knocking another to the ground with the shaft of his spear. The Rock King of Pike himself died when Gearman Steep bashed him over the head with his mace, and his skull shattered. Men were shouting. Axes were banging on shields. Only one name was called now. The priest was still in the center of the carnage, his eyes great and wild and terrified all at once. From the growing darkness on his salt-stained robes, the man had pissed himself.
Stay!
He was shrieking, calling, crying, loud and shrill to be heard over the drumming and dying.
Stay your arms! Stop this madness in the name of the drowned god!
An opening cleared in the outer ring, and the king made the summit. Euron Greyiron, befouled by blood, strode towards the center of the gathering. Upon his head was not the driftwood crown of kings past, but one of black iron, with vicious spokes in the shape of spearheads, arranged in a tight ring.
You shall be accursed for this! Only the drowned god can make a king! False! You are false!
Drowned God makes men, but it is men who make crowns.
Euron Greyiron took the false prophet's head off with a single slash of his sword. The hand that lifted his white staff was stained with blood. Slowly, Euron surveyed the scene, soaking in the blood and slaughter as the screams turned to silence.
From this day, the Iron Islands only have one king.